Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe and share. Help build my channel and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. The forgotten stories that shaped our world often lie buried beneath layers of commonly accepted history. Today's episode of Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions uncovers one such narrative, a story so profound it challenges everything most people understand about British identity. What if the very name, British, held a secret meaning connecting to ancient Hebrew traditions? What if a people called the Cimmerians were the key to understanding the complex tapestry of British history? This is the story of one of history's most fascinating identity transformations, how a nomadic people journeyed to the western edges of Europe, settled in what we now call the British Isles, and underwent such a complete reinvention that their original name has been all but erased from popular history. The Cimmerians were a nomadic people who, through generations of migration, eventually reached what Roman writers would later call the Isles of the West. These weren't casual wanderers but carriers of distinct cultural and religious practices that would leave an indelible mark on the islands they settled. The Cimmerian migration to what we now call the British Isles represents one of the most significant yet understudied population movements in ancient European history. These weren't small bands of travelers, this was a substantial migration that fundamentally shaped the ethnic and cultural landscape of these islands. The journey from nomadic existence to settled life marked the beginning of a remarkable transformation. Over time, these settlers underwent a fascinating identity evolution. They gradually abandoned their original racial designation, Cimmerian, and adopted a completely new identifier that had no relation to their ethnic origin. They became known as the British. What's particularly interesting is that this wasn't a name imposed on them by conquerors. It stands as a remarkable case study in collective identity transformation. The etymology of British itself holds a key to understanding this transformation, and it takes scholarship in an unexpected direction. The name, British, appears to have Hebrew language origins, connecting to the ancient relationship between Hebrew and Old Cymric languages. When breaking down the term, researchers have found something remarkable. The term, British, is actually a compound of two Hebrew elements, berith, meaning covenant, and ish, the word for people or men. Together, they create berithish, literally, covenant people. This linguistic connection raises fascinating questions about the religious and cultural identity of these early settlers. What's even more interesting is how the geographical designation evolved. When combined with an, a term denoting land, it produces Britain, literally meaning covenant land. This isn't just a place name, it's a theological statement. These Cimmerians weren't just adopting a new name, they were embracing a profound theological identity. They saw themselves as a covenant people inhabiting a covenant land. This framing would later take on new dimensions with the arrival of Christianity, where they reinterpreted themselves as consecrated people. Archaeological and historical records reveal that the Cimmerians maintained distinctive ceremonial behaviors centered around replicas of the Ark of the Covenant. These weren't casual religious practices, they were central to their identity. Foreign chroniclers often remarked on these unusual practices. What's particularly striking is how consistent these accounts are across centuries and from different observers. These weren't isolated incidents but established traditions that reflected deep cultural commitments. Several prominent scholars have documented the parallels between Cimmerian faith and Hebrew traditions. Sir Norman Lockyer found architectural connections between Stonehenge and ancient Near Eastern structures. Edward Davies identified ritual similarities between Druidic and Hebrew practices. William Stukeley's systematic analysis provided archaeological evidence supporting patriarchal connections between these seemingly disparate traditions. These weren't marginal academic theories but well-documented observations based on physical evidence and historical accounts. Primary historical sources also support these connections. Procopius of Caesarea, writing around 530 AD during the Gothic Wars, specifically referenced monotheistic beliefs among the people of these islands. Even earlier, Julius Caesar's ethnographic observations from 54 BC noted religious practices that stood apart from those of continental Celtic peoples. These historical accounts reveal a theological framework with distinctly monotheistic elements within what is often simplistically called Druidic tradition. The Cimmerians believed in a supreme deity, had a developed concept of soul immortality, and practiced a virtue-centered approach to spiritual development that shaped their social organization and ethical systems. If all Celtic peoples shared common origins, why was the name British applied exclusively to the inhabitants of the main island? Why did related Celtic groups maintain different designations? This question leads to an even more complex web of identity formation. The British designation was geographically limited to inhabitants of the main island, while related groups maintained separate identities with profound cultural implications. Continental Celtic populations were known as Gauls or Gallic peoples. There's an intriguing possible connection between these groups and the Galatians mentioned in biblical texts. Meanwhile, Hibernian, or Irish, identity developed separately, preserving pure Celtic heritage. Caledonian, Scottish, peoples adopted the Gael designation, which linguistically connects to the Gaul terminology. These distinctions weren't merely linguistic curiosities but reflected meaningful cultural differences that persisted despite geographical proximity. The collective terminology for these islands has its own fascinating evolution. Early sources used Britannic Isles, which later evolved into British Isles during the political unification under James I in the early 17th century. The designation, Great Britain, emerged from specific later historical circumstances. What's particularly interesting is how distinctly English identity developed within this framework. The term, English, itself has its own journey, and its relationship with broader British identity has ebbed and flowed throughout history, sometimes in harmonious integration and other times in tension. Successive migrations further complicated this identity landscape. The Anglo-Saxon arrival in 426 CE, the Norman conquest, and numerous smaller population movements didn't simply replace existing identities but created layers of cultural integration. But beneath these apparent differences lie underlying racial unity among British peoples. Celtic, Saxon, and Scandinavian stocks represented branches of a unified racial group, with tribal distinctions occurring within this common framework. This perspective reconceptualizes historical invasions as a form of racial convergence, almost as if Britain was destined to be the homeland where these scattered tribal groups would eventually reunite. The integration of diverse tribal elements while retaining distinctive characteristics within a unified whole allowed for the development of a shared national character that came to be recognized globally as distinctly British. This balancing act between unity and diversity would become a hallmark of British cultural identity. The story of the Cimmerians and their transformation reveals a remarkable synthesis of multiple heritage streams. This isn't just ancient history, it's the foundation upon which modern British identity was built. The British identity that would later spread across a global empire began as the story of people who themselves were migrants and identity shifters. The next time someone hears the word British, they might remember they're hearing an echo of an ancient Hebrew phrase that once meant covenant people, a testament to the enduring power of how societies name themselves and the profound meanings those names can carry across centuries. The historical record suggests that the Cimmerians didn't vanish, they transformed. They became the foundation of what would later be called the British people. Their religious practices influenced the development of pre-Christian and later Christian traditions on the islands. Their willingness to adopt new identities while maintaining cultural continuity set a pattern that would define British adaptability for centuries to come. Archaeological discoveries continue to uncover evidence of these ancient connections. Stone monuments, burial practices, and ritual objects tell a story of cultural continuity that spans thousands of years. The physical record supports what linguistic evidence suggests, that the British people's origins are more complex and more fascinating than conventional history often acknowledges. The story of the Cimmerians challenges conventional understanding of British origins. It suggests that what appears to be a straightforward national identity is actually layers of cultural identities written one atop another, with traces of the original still visible to those who know where to look. As archaeological techniques advance and linguistic research deepens, scholars continue to uncover new evidence of these ancient connections. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources. I hope you enjoyed this forgotten biblical story. Leave a like, comment, share and subscribe. This is very helpful. Join me next time for another lost story of our biblical history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.